Gunmetal Arcadia is a roguelike platform action game in which you progress through 3 different areas, fighting a plethora of enemies, mini-bosses, and bosses. As you progress, you will find different weapons, items, skills, and abilities that help you progress into even harder areas. The collectibles range from mundane to boring, to unique and fun, all the way to overpowered and game-breaking. Besides, upon death, which will happen a lot, you must start over from square one. There are no real permanent power-ups or unlockables. There is a legacy system, which awards you different starting conditions based on certain actions from previous runs, but that's about it. Gunmetal Arcadia is truly a roguelike game. The visuals and audio are superbly executed, giving older players a sense of nostalgia of games found on the old NES, such as Zelda 2. There are a plethora of different settings that let players fine-tune how they experience Gunmetal's visuals. You can play with crisp pixels, glowing neon effects, or old granulated visuals that remind you of an old television. As stated before, the audio is also very well done, and the music is very memorable and helps build Gunmetal as a game. But even with all the beauty which is found in Gunmetal, it just doesn't live up to the greatness of the era that it is trying to mimic. Gunmetal suffers from poor design, whether that is enemy design, level layout, gameplay, or player controls. For every moment of enjoyment that you find in Gunmetal, there are 2 or 3 frustrating moments that remove any fun you may be having. Let's first talk about the most glaring of all the poor design choices: player controls. Movement and combat are very unresponsive. Trying a precision jump attack in order to hit a flying enemy is rarely worth the effort, as your weapon lags behind your button pressed. Trying to jump or even move out of a projectile's path, more often than not, proves to be a fruitless effort. I always felt like I was either too late or too early to anticipate enemies' moves and attacks. Most enemies just hit you because, not that they're difficult, but purely out of bad controls and response times. It is a huge problem that most, if not all, of Gunmetal's difficulty comes from not being able to respond in time. There are literally points in the game that you must take unavoidable damage. There are times where chests will spawn above you, fall, hit, and there's no possible warning or way to avoid the damage. And yes, treasure chest hurting you is a strange design choice. There are times when you exit a screen just to find that you're falling into unavoidable lava, enemy fire, or other hazards. Once again, unable to avoid the damage. The worst offender is enemy placement. There are times in which enemies will be spawned on top of ladders with absolutely no way to progress, as when you take damage from that said enemy, you will promptly fall and have to repeat. The enemies themselves are boring and dull. Many only walk back and forth, shoot projectiles at a constant rate, or slowly shuffle about. And bosses aren't much better. They boil down to a dull, unpredictable, non-dangerous movement pattern. As you progress further and further into the game, you find very few new enemy types, or even boss types, but rather, the enemies and bosses simply have more health. This leads to times where you have to just sit and hit an enemy over and over for literally 10 seconds or more. Enemies and bosses are not fun, and if able, I choose to simply skip them, as the gold they drop is not worth my time nor effort. I wanted to like Gunmetal Arcadia, as it looks so much fun, and it reminded me of all my favorite childhood games. But not only does it not try to improve upon antiquated controls and gameplay, it does them worse in almost every instance than its inspiration it draws from. I do not recommend Gunmetal Arcadia. I want to take a moment and look at my claim that Gunmetal suffers from poor design, and really what that means. It goes without saying that my reviews are simply opinion and are painted by my own preferences and biases, but surely there is such a thing as poor design. It stands to reason that there are underlying principles that make some games widely accepted, whereas other games aren't. True, marketing ties into this a lot, but even with marketing, some games are received poorly, while some are received with glowing accolades. So I want to see if I can't, in part, identify some key indicators that can be generally accepted as poor game design. I would argue that any game with the following attributes can be defined as having bad game design. First, large amounts of monotonous content that require little to no skill. Second, in-game punishment for arbitrary or unavoidable reasons. Think a player can't possibly avoid damage sort of situation. And third and last, choke points that are impossible for players to proceed past. such as a pit a player falls into, but they can't jump out no matter what and they have to reset the game. There are many more tenets to bad game design, but these are just some of the biggest offenders in my book. So let's study how Gunmetal Arcadia contains all three of these and how it ruins what may have been a reasonably enjoyable game. Speaking to my first point, large amounts of monotonous content that require little to no skill is bad game design. As stated previously, Gunmetal Arcadia is an action platformer, but the action and the platforming require very little skill or creativity. There is little enjoyment found in the very linear navigation of the levels or combat. The longer a player makes it in a specific run, the more hit points the enemies have, and the more you have to just sit there and hit them over and over and over and over again. If you don't mind spoilers, at the end of this video I will show you the final boss fight and what it is reduced down to. I find enjoyment from games that challenge and are rigorous, pitting my skill versus the well-crafted challenge from the game designer. If a game is reduced to nothing more than simply repeated actions, all of my enjoyment is drained and the game by definition becomes a chore. As a youth, my favorite games were the old Final Fantasy games. But the older I get, the more I realize those games simply expanded a lot of the good things by filling it up with a slew of unskippable battles that I could literally just hold down the button A to pass. This kind of gameplay can be addictive, I mean, think mobile games, but it isn't enjoyable. At least not for me. I prefer short, interesting engagements over long, repetitive bouts. My second point is, in-game punishment for arbitrary or unavoidable reasons is bad game design. One of my favorite games of all times is Dark Souls 3. Many people think Dark Souls is unfairly punishing players, but I would argue every time I died to a trap, a pit, or an enemy, it was my own fault. I didn't look at the environment close enough, I ran in dangerously, haphazardly, without thinking, or I simply didn't dodge an attack in time. Dark Souls is punishing, but it punishes sloppy play. Gunmetal Arcadia, on the other hand, punishes play. Simply playing the game will result in you getting hit, bumped, and killed for no reason at times. There are obviously times skill could prevent damage or injury, but there are plenty of other times when no warning is telegraphed, no skill could mitigate, and no foresight would prevent the damage about to ensue. As stated previously, there are chests that spawn with no warning above your head, enemies that appear out of nowhere to deal damage, and environmental hazards that appear literally beneath your feet with no warning. This constant, unavoidable punishment is not fun because you can't improve to avoid it. It is simply a constant that runs throughout the whole game. It feels reminiscent of receiving low grades from a teacher simply because they don't like you, not because of the quality of work handed in. Games that punish for no rhyme or reason suffer from bad game design because there's literally nothing enjoyable about it. The third and final point I want to look at is the unpassable obstacle, the hard reset, the roadblock that can't be circumvented. Gunmetal Arcadia has occasional points that are literally unpassable. A monster on a ledge or a ladder that cannot be defeated because it can't be hit. And if it can't be hit, it can't be passed because it's sitting upon a choke point. A point that you ultimately must reach. Moments like this are not common in Gunmetal, but the fact that they occur at all is bad game design. It becomes a game that can't be played, literally. A game that can't get to where it needs to get to. Unsurpassable obstacles are not fun and are simply bad game design. So in short, if your game's main gameplay is monotonous, that is bad game design. If you punish a player for no rhyme or reason, that's bad game design. If you have anywhere in your game that stops the player from being able to play your game, that is bad game design. Our games may not be perfect, but we can study and learn from others to better help avoid the same mistakes and pitfalls. Now, as stated before, I'm about to show you the final boss. If you do not want spoilers, please turn this video off at this time. I had a common build that isn't necessarily unique or hard to get, and one of the items makes me temporarily invincible. I had one of the strongest weapons, and still, I had to sit there for nearly 45 seconds, not moving, hitting the boss over and over again. I didn't have to dodge, I didn't have to move, I simply sat still and attacked. This is what most of the boss fights are.